Hi all. Short video here to talk about the history, the context for your map assignment. Your map assignment takes place in what is today Nova Scotia, but was in this time period, well, the British called it Nova Scotia, the French called it Acadia. But I want to look at the broad swath of that history so that you can better understand, as you're thinking about these maps and these documents, what's on the minds of the people who are creating those maps, making those plans. So here's the French Empire in 1730. We don't, in this course, it's a North Atlantic course, we should spend a lot of time with the French, but we can't cover everything. And we don't spend a lot of time really focusing on the French. It's a useful little reminder here that the French Empire in the 18th century, and for that matter in the 19th century, is a huge territory. The French lose the 7 Years' War, and they lose the territory in North America, but they don't lose territory in the rest of the world. In fact, do quite well in the rest of the world. Well into the 19th century, France will remain a major colonial power. I want to zoom in on some of the details of this. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see some smaller colonies in Africa. Those are really not properly speaking colonies. They're more or less trading posts. They often call them factories. It's places largely are trading posts in the slave trade. But you can also see on the left-hand side of the screen those Caribbean islands, which of course are sugar islands, plantation economies, where the labor is largely provided by African slaves. That's very much that North Atlantic slave trade economy that the French are important players in. But quickly back to North America, you can see that huge swath of territory, and note where it goes. It goes basically from Newfoundland and Nova Scotia in the northeast, all the way down into what is today parts of Mexico, but mostly the modern state of Louisiana in the United States, and of course the city of New Orleans. And of course New Orleans was originally a French city. When we think of the French Empire, we tend to think of the major centers, like the city of Quebec, Louisbourg in Acadia, Nova Scotia, and of course the city of New Orleans in the south. And the location of those cities is really, really important. The French were very good at holding strategic points on the map. And this map gives us a really nice illustration of that. If you think of where, this is from 1758, it's a map, a British map showing this territory on the very eve of the 7 Years' War, actually in the midst of the 7 Years' War. There is Louisbourg on modern-day Nova Scotia. And Louisbourg is strategically very important because it allows you to have a naval presence here in the North Atlantic. It also controls access to the Gulf of St. Lawrence here. It also, therefore, controls access to the St. Lawrence River, where Quebec and Montreal are. That controls access to the Great Lakes. So in terms of a kind of choke point for getting at the interior of North America, the French hold all these key territories. If we move on and look at New Orleans, down here in the Gulf of Mexico, New Orleans is at the mouth of the Mississippi River, and we can follow the Mississippi River all the way up into the interior of North America. That means that the entire interior of North America, access to the entire interior of North America, is controlled by the French. And the British didn't like this at all, and the British colonists in particular didn't like this at all. From a British perspective, as this text at the bottom, you can't read it here, but the text at the bottom makes note towards the very end that the French have made a chain of garrisons and settlements from the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the Gulf of Mexico. And that's certainly true. They were hemming the British in. And so from their perspective, not only is the French an alien presence, they're preventing them from expanding into North America and better controlling the territory and enlarging the colonies as they might wish. Of course, the French view that from the exact opposite perspective. We're going to spend our time in this assignment looking at French and British maps of this territory, Acadia, Nova Scotia, in the time period of the 7 Years' War, and trying to figure out what those maps are trying to show us, that kind of meaning that they're imparting to those maps. They're trying to tell us things with those maps. They're trying to show things with those maps. And we want to spend some time trying to figure that stuff out. This map nicely shows the situation in the time period we're looking at. All of your maps, all of your evidence comes from a period where these islands, these two green islands, modern-day Prince Edward Island, modern-day Cape Breton, Ile Saint-Jean, Ile Royale, were French territories. This, the mainland of Nova Scotia, was a British territory. Now, this is a British map, so they show this territory as part of Nova Scotia. They show this as British-controlled. But in fact, the peace treaty from 1713 hadn't been especially clear on that. So this territory was actually disputed in this period. So let's look at how this situation came to be, because this will be helpful for you thinking about these maps. So here's Nova Scotia, just an outline map of Nova Scotia. So how did it get to this point that we're at? Well, prior to European colonization, Nova Scotia was not Nova Scotia. It was not Acadie. It was Mi'kmaq. It was the place of the Mi'kmaq people. And in fact, that territory extends into modern-day New Brunswick onto Prince Edward Island as well. Mi'kmaq was Mi'kmaq territory, and Mi'kmaq peoples were throughout those areas. Mi'kmaq people still call this territory Mi'kmaq today, but we're looking at the imperial overwritings of all of that story. Beginning in the 17th century, in 1604, it was claimed by France and was named the French colony of Acadie. And that colony, as we see it here, existed between 1604 and 1713. So this is what you would see on a typical French map of the 17th or early 18th century. You would see this as a French territory called Acadie. Except if you look for a French presence in this place, you see a much smaller set of territories. Here, on what's today called the Annapolis River, was then called the Rivière du Dauphin, you see settlements around the area that is the capital of the colony, Port Royal. And over the next couple of decades, colonists spread out into different areas. They move into this area called the Minas Basin, and they move into this area, which is called the Chignecto Strait. And there are other Acadian French people in the territory, but not many. A couple hundred spread out over the coastlines, very, very small settlements around the area. The concentrated populations, a couple thousand in each, are in these three areas. That's really all you're looking at for a substantial French presence in the colony. So really, the reality on the ground is that this is still Mi'kmaq. It's still a Mi'kmaq territory, still largely controlled by Mi'kmaq people. And it's pretty clear that the French Acadian people are there because the Mi'kmaq allow them to be there. And they want them to be there. There's tensions will emerge over time, but largely it's a peaceful relationship. Largely it's a good trading relationship. There's even some level of intermarriage between the peoples. Not a great deal, but some level of intermarriage between the peoples. So there's fairly good relationships there. And over time, and over the course of these wars with Britain, that relationship will actually, in fact, strengthen. So I've got these dates there, 1604 to 1713. What does it mean? Why does it end in 1713? Because in 1710, the British, in a war, captured Acadia's capital, Port Royal, in 1710. Port Royal is over here where the star is. And the peace treaty at the end of the war awarded this mainland territory, which you see here in red, to the British, and reserved the yellow areas, PEI and Cape Breton, to the French. And that becomes kind of the status quo afterwards. And you can see I've also got New Brunswick still there as that kind of disputed territory, because that was not entirely clear what was going on afterwards. Except the British don't really send any substantial number of soldiers in and very few settlers in. So largely speaking, it's still Mi'kmaq, and in some ways it's certainly more Acadie than it is Nova Scotia, at least in terms of people on the ground. You have about 10,000 Acadians, you have about 5,000 Mi'kmaq people, and you have a couple hundred British people, and most of them are soldiers, not settlers. So it's a very, very small British presence here. So it's still largely French people and Mi'kmaq people in the territory. Over the course of the period between 1713 and over the next couple of decades, the British and the French prepare for war. And I say prepare for war because in this period, the British and the French are practically at war all the time. Not all the time, but damn near. There's more or less continuous warfare there. So almost immediately after their retreat from the mainland of Nova Scotia onto Cape Breton, they build a new fortress, a fortress called Louisbourg. And it's an impressive fortress. It's the biggest fortress ever built in North America. And it was meant to be, they called it the Gibraltar of North America. It was meant to be an impregnable defensive position that the French could hold as long as they wanted to hold it. And in response to that, the British build their own fortress at a place that doesn't exist prior to its establishment, but here at Halifax. And they will build an impressive fortress there as well. Not as impressive as Louisbourg, but an impressive fortress as well. Except what we need to keep in mind here is that these are not just fortresses. I mean, they're fortresses, but they're really about controlling the water. They're really ports. They're really heavily defended ports, because what they really want is to be able to sail ships freely, both for fishing purposes and trade purposes, but also getting back and forth soldiers, people, communications, everything between their home countries, back to Britain, back to France, and so on. So this is really about controlling this territory here. Very, very important to understanding that story. Where we're going to be focusing a lot of our attention is along that border area between the disputed area in modern-day New Brunswick and here on the mainland. That's where most of the people that we'll be looking at in some of the maps. So, in 1758, after our maps, the British captured Louisbourg and Quebec, and eventually all of the rest of North America. And this happens in the subsequent 2 years afterwards. So it's pretty easy, eh? We can just look at this map and say, well, there you go. The British captured all this territory. Easy, right? Well, yes, but not for the period we're looking at. In fact, not for a period that's almost 50 years long. Think about it, 50 years. We're not talking 5 years or 6 years or 7 years. We're talking 50 years here. Fairly substantial period. 2.5 generations of people will live and die in the period that we're talking about. So not an insignificant period. And so that's why it's interesting to look at these maps. This is not just a kind of fleeting moment. It's actually a significant period in the thinking of both British and French strategy from an imperial perspective, but also the people on the ground and how they're responding to this situation and how their lives are being altered by this situation. So this is the territory we'll be looking at. This is how we will look at the map. This will be the situation on the ground when you start looking at these maps. The maps will tell you different things than this, but practically this is what's happening. Practically there's a border here. And in fact, you'll look at some of your documents will point to 2 fortifications, one here and one here. And one's British over here and one's French over here. And that represents the 2 empires attempting to police a border, to control access between different parts of the territory, but also to control the people that are there. The French know there are French people there. They want to control them. They want the French people to support them. The French people, on the other hand, are less keen on that. What they really want is peace and stability. They're not interested in defending the French Empire or defending the British Empire for that matter. They're mostly interested in defending their farms and defending their ways of lives and protecting their families. So the general situation for you to think about when you look at these maps is that this is British territory. It's officially British territory. And this over here is officially French territory. They have their big fortress there at Louisbourg, and they have farms and settlers and fishing people and so on. Except on the ground, most of the people in this British territory are in fact French people. They're French Catholics in British Protestant territory. And that religious aspect, it's not really part of your assignment, but that religious aspect is very much a part of the story. But of course, what's also going on here is that while there is a substantial French population here, there's still dominance on the ground, military dominance on the ground, and in many ways trade dominance on the ground by the Mi'kmaq people. They are not showing up so much, although look, you'll see them in places, not showing up so much on these maps, but they are there, and they are certainly important, and they are certainly being courted and diplomatically dealt with by all of these parties. So the Mi'kmaq will be an important part of the story too. They're just harder to see. That's the general situation on the ground. This is the kind of story that will help you understand the basics of what's happening in those maps. The maps will tell you different things. That's the whole point of maps. They're meant to tell you a story. They have a point of view. They want to convince you of something. I want you to try to look at the maps and the documents that I've given you as well, but particularly the maps, and try to understand the strategies of the maps and how they're trying to represent reality on the ground. Sometimes it's close to reality, and sometimes it's not. And that's the interesting part about these maps. They can be very deceptive. They look clear as day. They look simple. They just outline where people and places are. But as you'll see looking at these maps, they betray much more than that. And certainly from the British perspective, they also betray the aspirations of the British imperial state for what they want for Nova Scotia. I think there's a lot to look at in this assignment, a lot to think about. But I think it's also a fun assignment. I think you'll enjoy looking at these maps. I think you'll see lots going on here. But there is a lot of information there. So I want to give you a little quick guide to thinking about, or of where to kind of concentrate your efforts. Because look at this map. There's all kinds of places, all kinds of islands, all kinds of rivers. Where should you be looking? Well, a little quick guide to where the concentrations of population are. I've kind of already told you this, but I'll point to them really, really specifically in this context right here. First one, right here in the Chignecto Channel, that area roughly today at the New Brunswick-Nova Scotia border, significant Acadian population there. Another one here around this basin here, Minas Basin, around this area here. Again, a significant Acadian farming population there. And then the third one here along the Annapolis River, again, a significant, some British settlement there, but still a significant French population there as well. There's other ones as well. There's a small one over here, and there's some ones up here, further up these rivers. Along these coasts, there's all kinds of other ones. Two other ones I can quickly point to. One is Halifax. There's very little information about Halifax on these maps, and that's not surprising because most of these maps are being made by people in Halifax or for people in Halifax. They know what's in Halifax. They want to know what's going on out in the frontier, out in the margins, out on the edges of the colony. That's what they don't know. That's what they have to have concrete maps to know what's going on out there. The other one is this one here, further south along the coast. This is the first significant, outside of Halifax, the first significant British attempt to settle people in the colony of Nova Scotia. They've held it for over 40 years when they bring these people in. They're Germans. They're in a place called Lunenburg, and Lunenburg might sound German. It is German. It's a German village. And those people are brought in. You might think, why would they bring in Germans? Well, they bring them in because they're Protestants. And what they're really trying to do is settle the colony with, as long as these people are not Catholic, they're happy. So they bring in these Protestant settlers. They bring in people who are experienced fishing people. Lunenburg is right on the coast. It has decent but not great agricultural possibilities, but what they're really wanting to do is have a kind of strong fishing presence there, and they want to develop that dimension of the local resource economy. So those are the areas that you might concentrate. There's other places you can look. You can look down here. Canso is a significant fishing area. There's also some fishing villages here and here. But those five that I've outlined here with the arrows, those are the biggest ones by far. So that's probably where you should direct your attention, because that's probably where the map makers are also directing their attention. They're going to be drawn to the places where the most people are, where the most control needs to be affected. And that's where they focus their attentions. So I hope that's helpful. It's a messy little story. There's no doubt about it. We like to have stories that are kind of simple, X people here, and then they move on or leave or stay. That's kind of simple. This one's kind of blurry and confusing because you have French people, Indigenous people, British control, lack of British control, all kinds of things going on there. But that's the reality of history. Most histories, particularly in colonial settings, particularly in areas that are on the edges of empire, as it were, between the major colonies. These are often war zones. They're often blurred in terms of their specific politics, their specific controls, their specific boundaries. It's not as clear cut as it is in other places. That's your challenge, to get in there and try to understand some of that. Have fun. Take care.